Cynthia didn't hear the people shouting, "Leave him, he is just a beggar." All she heard was the sound of a man's hand hitting the water and going under. The water under the Lagos Bridge was moving fast that afternoon. Rain had fallen in the morning, so the current was strong. A man in a dirty black suit was fighting for his life in it. One of his hands came up, fingers shaking, like he was calling the world to pity him. Cars slowed on the bridge. People gathered, but nobody jumped. Then a slim, dark-skinned young woman with torn brown gown and wet hair flying behind her ran. That was Cynthia. Before anyone could stop her, she climbed the side of the bridge and jumped. People screamed. Some covered their mouths. One woman said, "This girl has killed herself because of a poor man." A man selling recharge cards said, "Who told her to help? Can that beggar pay her back?" But Cynthia was not thinking about that. The water was cold. It entered her eyes and nose. She pushed her legs hard, swam to where the man had gone down, and grabbed him. He was heavy, much heavier than she thought. His suit, his shoes, even his hair, all soaked. His eyes were closed. He didn't even know someone was risking her life for him. "Please, don't die," she said into his ear, even though he could not hear. She wrapped one arm around him and used the other to push the water away. It was hard. Cynthia was not a big woman. She was just a 24-year-old orphan who sold bottled water on the street and sometimes washed clothes to eat. But she was strong in the one thing her late parents taught her: be kind, even when people laugh at you. Above them, people looked down from the bridge. Some pointed, some brought out phones. Nobody jumped in to help. Slowly, painfully, Cynthia pulled the man toward the side of the bridge where the concrete met the water. There was no ladder, no line, just rough edges filled with green moss. "Hold Am, small girl, push Am up," someone shouted, but still nobody came close. Cynthia's hands were shaking. The man's head kept falling back. Water dripped from his eyelashes. His black suit, which had looked dirty before, now looked like something from the gutter. To everyone on the bridge, he was a nobody. Maybe a madman, maybe a drunk, maybe a poor beggar. To Cynthia, he was a human being. She placed both her palms on the concrete, pressed her shoulder under his chest, and with a cry that came from deep inside her, she pushed. For a second, it looked like both of them would fall back into the water. For a second, people on the bridge said, "Chai, they have drowned together." Then Cynthia's knee found a crack in the concrete. She used it. She pulled, she climbed, and she came out. Wet, gasping, brown gown torn in two places, hair scattered and pasted to her face, in her arms, the man. She was carrying him like a mother carries a sick child. His black suit was soaked. His white shirt was no longer white. His hand hung loose. His head rested on her chest. The bridge went quiet. You could hear only cars stopping, people clicking phones, the water below moving like nothing big had just happened. Cynthia stood there, shaking, looking at them. "So, none of you could help," she said, her breath fast. Nobody answered. Some were ashamed, some were still thinking, why did she risk her life for a useless man? Then, right at that moment, the sound of an engine cut through the silence. A big black SUV drove in from the other side and stopped in front of the crowd. It was not a random car. It was clean, expensive, and the way it stopped showed someone inside was in a hurry. The door opened. 3 dark-skinned Nigerian men in expensive corporate suits came down. Their eyes went straight to the man in Cynthia's arms. First, their faces changed, from confusion to shock to fear. Then, to everyone's surprise, all 3 of them bent their heads a little and said at the same time, "Boss." The people on the bridge looked at one another. Boss? For who? This dirty man? Cynthia's mouth opened a little. She looked down at the man she was holding. He was still unconscious. He still looked like a wet beggar. But these men in suit, these men that looked like managers in a bank, were bowing for him. The tallest of the 3 ran to her. "Madam, please let us take him," he said, voice shaking. "You saved his life." He turned to the other 2. "Carry boss, gently, gently." The other 2 men rushed forward and with full respect collected the wet man from Cynthia like they were carrying gold. Even while he was unconscious, they were careful. They did not let his head drop. They did not shout at him. They carried him the way junior staff carry a chairman. People on the bridge started to whisper, "Wait, did she just save a big man?" But he was looking like a beggar. I even abused her. The first man, the one who spoke to Cynthia, turned back to her. He looked at her wet clothes. He looked at her shaking shoulders, his eyes softened. "Young lady," he said, "do you know who you just pulled out of that water?" Cynthia blinked. "No, sir. I only knew he needed help." The man smiled in a way that showed relief. "You just saved the billionaire CEO of Johnson's group of companies," he said quietly, like he was telling her a secret. "You just saved our chairman." Every single person on that bridge froze. Someone dropped their phone. A woman who had said, "Leave him, he is poor," covered her face. The recharge card seller stepped back, shame all over his face. The man in suit was not done. He took Cynthia's hand, the same hand that had just pulled a billionaire from death, and said, "Please follow us to the hospital. The whole company must thank you." Cynthia stared at him, water still dripping from her hair. Her heart beating fast, her mind trying to understand what God had just done in front of all those people who laughed at her. And at that exact moment, from the SUV, one of the men shouted, "Sir, he is not breathing well." The street shook again. Cynthia froze when she heard the shout. "Sir, he's not breathing well." Her wet hands trembled, her eyes darted to the black SUV where two of the suited men were desperately trying to help the unconscious man, Johnson. One of them was pressing his chest up and down, the other kept saying, "Boss, please stay with us." The crowd that had been whispering in awe began to panic. Some shouted for an ambulance. Others backed away, afraid something worse might happen. The sound of horns, voices, and rushing water mixed together until it felt like Lagos itself was holding its breath. Cynthia ran toward the car. "Let me help," she cried. "Please, just let me help." The man who had earlier held her hand, now sweating under pressure, stepped aside. "Do you know first aid?" he asked quickly. "I watched people do it once," Cynthia said, kneeling beside Johnson. "But I'll try." She placed her hands on his chest, counting softly under her breath. 1, 2, 3. Then she leaned down and breathed into his mouth. Everyone went silent. Again. 1, 2, 3. She pressed and breathed. After a few tense seconds, Johnson coughed. Water spilled from his mouth, his chest lifted weakly, and a faint sound escaped his lips. "He's breathing," one of the men shouted. "He's alive." The crowd burst into relieved murmurs. Some clapped, some even smiled. Cynthia fell backward, tears mixing with the rain on her cheeks. Her entire body ached, but her heart felt light. The first man, whose name she later learned was Mr. Fred, gave a short, urgent command. "Quickly, take him to St. Luke's Hospital, Ikoyi, now." The men lifted Johnson carefully into the SUV. Fred turned to Cynthia. "Please, come with us. You deserve to see him safe." Cynthia hesitated. "Me? I'm just—" "No," he interrupted. "You're not just anything. You saved a life when everyone else did nothing. Get in." She climbed into the back seat, her torn gown still dripping wet, her hands shaking. As the car sped off, she looked out the window. The same people who had mocked her were now bowing their heads as the SUV drove past. The drive to the hospital was tense. Fred sat in the front seat, constantly calling someone on the phone. "Yes, it's Mr. Johnson." "No, he's not dead." "We're on our way. Prepare the emergency team now." Cynthia sat quietly, her eyes fixed on Johnson's still face. Even though his hair was messy and his clothes were ruined, there was something calm about him now, like a sleeping king. She couldn't believe it. Hours ago she was selling bottled water under the same bridge, and now she was sitting in the same car with a billionaire. Her mind drifted. What if I hadn't jumped, she thought. Would he have died there while everyone watched? When they arrived, nurses rushed to the entrance with stretchers. "This way," a doctor shouted. They lifted Johnson out, still connected to an oxygen bag, and wheeled him into the emergency room. Cynthia stood by the door, watching helplessly. Her legs felt weak. Fred came to her side and spoke softly. "Don't worry, you've done your part. They'll take care of him now." She nodded. "Will he be okay?" He sighed. He swallowed a lot of water, but he's strong. If God kept him alive through that river, he'll keep him alive in here. Fred handed her a towel. You should dry yourself, miss. You're freezing. Cynthia wrapped the towel around her shoulders. Her lips were trembling, but not from cold. She was still in shock. Hours passed. The sky darkened, and the lights in the hospital corridor reflected softly on the floor. Cynthia sat on a wooden bench, watching nurses hurry back and forth. Fred had made several calls to the board and the press. She didn't understand most of what he said, but she could tell the man she'd saved was very, very important. Finally, near midnight, Fred came back to her. His face looked tired, but his eyes carried a little hope. He's stable, he said. Cynthia let out a deep breath she didn't know she was holding. Thank God. Fred smiled. He's still unconscious, but the doctors said if he makes it through the night, he'll survive. She covered her face with her hands. I was so scared. I thought he'd die because of me. Fred placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. No, young lady, he lived because of you. He sat beside her for a moment. What's your name? Cynthia, she said quietly. Cynthia Ease. Do you have any family we can call? She shook her head. My parents died years ago. It's just me. Fred studied her face for a moment. Her eyes were red but determined, the kind of eyes that had seen pain yet still chose kindness. You'll be rewarded for this, he said softly. I'll make sure of it. Cynthia smiled faintly. I didn't do it for money. I know, he replied, and that's exactly why your life will change. The next morning, sunlight filled the hospital room. Cynthia was sleeping on the same bench when a nurse tapped her shoulder. He's awake, the nurse said gently. Cynthia jumped to her feet. What? The nurse nodded. Mr. Johnson, he's asking who saved him. Cynthia followed her into the room. The billionaire lay on the bed, pale but breathing. His eyes, deep, calm and intelligent, turned toward her as she entered. Fred stood nearby, smiling. Sir, this is the young woman who saved your life. Johnson's lips moved weakly. His voice was low but clear. You jumped in? For me? Cynthia nodded, nervous. Yes, sir, I couldn't watch you drown. He looked at her for a long moment, then whispered, Thank you for choosing kindness when everyone ignored me. Tears filled her eyes. She didn't know what to say. Fred placed a hand on Johnson's shoulder. Rest, sir. We'll talk more later. As Cynthia turned to leave, Johnson's faint voice stopped her. Miss Cynthia. She looked back. You didn't just save my life, he said. You've given it meaning again. Cynthia's heart skipped, and in that quiet hospital room, filled with the smell of medicine and the soft beep of a heart monitor, a story much bigger than either of them had just begun. The news spread across Lagos like wildfire. The billionaire who was saved by a poor orphan, read one headline the next morning. Mystery girl who jumped from bridge identified as Orphan, named Cynthia Ease. Everyone who had stood on that bridge watching the incident was now searching for her face online. Some claimed they knew her, others lied that she was their neighbor. But the truth was simple. Cynthia was just a kind orphan who had no idea that one act of kindness would change her life forever. At St. Luke's Hospital, Johnson's room was filled with flowers and visitors. Powerful men in suits and reporters crowded the hallways. But Johnson himself wanted peace. He told the nurses, No cameras, no interviews, please. I need rest. There was only one person he wanted to see. Cynthia. Fred walked into the waiting room where Cynthia sat quietly in a plain hospital gown, the towel still around her shoulders. She looked out of place among the visitors in fine clothes, but there was calmness in her eyes. Cynthia, Fred said softly, Mr. Johnson wants to see you. She looked up in surprise. Me? Yes. He's been asking for you since he woke up. Her heart pounded as she followed him down the corridor. When they entered the private room, Johnson turned his head slowly toward her. He looked better now, pale but awake, with an IV in his hand and a soft smile that made him look younger than his 40 years. Cynthia bowed slightly, unsure what to say. Good afternoon, sir. Johnson motioned for her to come closer. Please, sit. She sat gently by the bed, her hands folded on her lap. I owe you my life, he began, his voice still weak but sincere. You didn't know who I was, yet you risked everything to save me." Cynthia shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, sir. I only did what I was taught, to help anyone in need." Johnson smiled faintly. "Your parents must have been good people." Her eyes softened. "They were. But they died when I was 15. Since then, I've just been surviving, washing clothes, selling bottled water, doing whatever I can." Johnson was silent for a moment, then he said, "You've done more than survive, Cynthia. You've shown humanity what it means to care." Tears filled her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like that before, not since her parents died. 3 days later, Johnson was discharged. Fred insisted that Cynthia come along in the convoy that took him home. The hospital staff waved as the black SUVs rolled out of the compound. When the car stopped in front of a white mansion in Ikoyi, Cynthia's jaw dropped. The building looked like something from a dream: tall glass windows, marble floors, golden railings. There were gardeners, guards, and maids all standing in a neat line waiting for their boss. As Johnson stepped out, everyone bowed. The moment reminded Cynthia of the bridge, except now she understood why. Fred guided her gently inside. "Welcome to Johnson Mansion," he said proudly. Cynthia hesitated at the door, afraid to dirty the clean marble with her old slippers. "Are you sure I should come in?" Fred smiled. "You saved the man who owns this place. You deserve to be here." Inside, the mansion sparkled. Crystal chandeliers hung above, and soft classical music played from hidden speakers. Everything smelled of fresh roses. Johnson, now seated in a wheelchair temporarily for recovery, called out, "Fred, please show her to the guest room. She'll stay here for a while." Cynthia blinked. "Sir, I can't." "You can," Johnson interrupted gently. "You need rest too. You've done enough for others. Now let someone care for you." It was the first time anyone had ever said those words to her. Days turned into weeks. Cynthia slowly adjusted to the new environment. The maids adored her for her humility. She helped them fold laundry, cleaned dishes, and even watered the flowers, despite their protests. One afternoon, Johnson asked her to join him in the garden. The air smelled of jasmine, and the sun cast a golden glow on the fountain nearby. He looked much stronger now, dressed in a white polo and cream trousers. "Cynthia," he said as she sat beside him, "have you ever thought of what you'd like to do with your life?" She smiled shyly. "I have dreams, sir, but dreams don't feed people." "Tell me anyway." "I've always loved computers," she said. "Before my parents died, I wanted to study software engineering. I love building things that make life easier. But school was too expensive." Johnson nodded slowly. "You're intelligent, I can see it. The way you speak, the way you think, you just need an opportunity." She laughed softly. "People like me don't get those kinds of opportunities." He looked at her, serious now. "Maybe not before, but from now on you will." Her smile faded. "Sir?" Johnson leaned forward. "Your kindness didn't just save me. It reminded me that power means nothing without purpose. You want to be a software engineer. You will be one." Her eyes widened. "I don't understand." He smiled. "I've already spoken to Fred. You'll get a full scholarship to Lagos Tech University. Tuition, housing, everything covered. You start next month." Cynthia gasped. "Sir, you can't." "I can," he interrupted again, "and I will. You didn't wait for permission to save me, so I won't wait for permission to change your life." Her eyes filled with tears. She covered her mouth, speechless. "Thank you," she whispered at last. "Thank you, sir. I won't disappoint you." He smiled warmly. "I know you won't." The weeks before her admission passed quickly. Fred took her shopping for school supplies, new clothes, a laptop, textbooks, and a phone. For the first time in her life, Cynthia felt like someone who mattered. When she resumed classes, she studied harder than anyone else. Every lecture reminded her of why she was there, not because of luck, but because of kindness. Johnson visited sometimes, watching quietly from his car so he wouldn't distract her. 4 years passed in what felt like a heartbeat. Cynthia graduated top of her class with first-class honors. At the ceremony, when she walked on stage to receive her award, Johnson was there, clapping with pride. After the ceremony, he said, "Now it's time you joined the company." Me? Work at Johnson's Group. Why not? He said with a smile. You saved the owner. You deserve a seat inside, not outside. A few months later, Cynthia began working as a junior software engineer at Johnson's Group. The same girl who once begged for jobs now designed systems used by millions. Her co-workers admired her, though few knew her story. Every evening, when the office lights dimmed, Johnson would visit her workspace. They'd talk about ideas, future plans, and sometimes about life and loss. One night, after a long meeting, he said softly, "You know, Cynthia, I never told you how my parents died." She turned, surprised. "No, sir, you never did." He sighed deeply. "They were murdered by my father's political rivals. I was only 19. I inherited everything overnight: money, power, enemies. But after that, I stopped trusting people." Cynthia looked at him sadly. "That must have been hard." "It was, but then I met someone who reminded me what love and courage look like," he said, his eyes resting gently on her. "You." Cynthia's heart skipped. She looked away, her face warm. "Sir," he smiled, "call me Johnson, please." And as the night breeze moved softly through the open office window, both of them knew something deeper than gratitude had begun to grow between them. The rain came again that night, slow, soft and calm, the kind that Lagos people call sleeping rain. But Cynthia couldn't sleep. She stood at the wide glass window of her small apartment inside Johnson's mansion, watching the lights of Ikoyi blink in the distance. Everything she once dreamed of was now her reality: a home, an education, a career. Yet something in her chest kept beating louder whenever she thought about him. Johnson. The same man she had once dragged from a river now walked into every thought she had. His calm smile, his deep voice, the way he always said, "You didn't just save my life, you gave me one." Cynthia hugged herself and sighed. "Stop it," she whispered. "He's your boss, not your destiny." But her heart didn't listen. The next morning, Cynthia arrived at Johnson's Group headquarters, a 12-story glass building in Victoria Island with the company's logo glowing proudly at the top. Her colleagues greeted her respectfully now. She was no longer the charity case. She was engineer Cynthia Ease, one of the smartest coders in the company. Johnson entered the building not long after. Cameras flashed, staff lined the hallway to greet him. But he didn't care about the attention. His eyes went straight to where Cynthia stood by the elevator. "Good morning, Cynthia," he said warmly, his deep voice echoing slightly in the marble hallway. "Good morning, sir," she replied with a shy smile. "Join me in my office. I'd like you to see something." Her heart skipped, but she followed. Inside the top-floor office, the city spread out below them like a sea of silver and blue. Johnson handed her a file. "These are plans for our new tech branch, Johnson Digital. I want you to lead the software division." Cynthia gasped. "Sir, me?" He smiled. "Why not you? You've earned it." Her voice shook. "But there are senior engineers, and none of them would have risked their life for a stranger," he said softly, walking closer. "None of them have your courage." Cynthia looked down, blushing. "You still remember that day?" He laughed quietly. "I can't forget the day a girl jumped into a river for me. Every time I close my eyes, I see you climbing out of the water, brave, soaked, holding my life in your arms." The room went silent. The rain outside tapped gently on the glass. Cynthia could feel her heartbeat in her throat. "I didn't do it to be remembered," she said quietly. "I just couldn't watch you die." "And I can't stop watching you live," he replied, his voice lower now. Cynthia froze. Their eyes met, and for the first time it wasn't gratitude in his gaze. It was something deeper, warmer, real. Before she could find words, the door opened. Fred stepped in, carrying a tablet. "Sir, the board is ready for your approval on the merger," he announced, then stopped awkwardly when he sensed the tension in the air. Johnson quickly turned toward him. "I'll be there in a minute, Fred." Fred nodded and quietly left, closing the door behind him. Cynthia cleared her throat nervously. "I should go too, sir." Johnson's eyes softened. "Cynthia," but she was already walking toward the door. "Congratulations on the new branch, sir," she said quickly, forcing a polite smile before leaving. That night, Cynthia couldn't focus. She tried reading, coding, even praying, but her heart wouldn't settle. Johnson's words replayed in her mind like music. "I can't stop watching you live." The next evening, she was surprised when Fred called her. "Miss Cynthia, Mr. Johnson requests your presence at the Garden restaurant by the mansion tonight." "The Garden?" she asked, confused. "Yes, ma'am. It's urgent, but—" "Peaceful," he said with a knowing tone. Cynthia smiled nervously. "All right, I'll come." The garden was glowing with soft lights and the gentle sound of a fountain. Johnson sat at a small round table, dressed in a grey dinner suit. No tie, just calm elegance. When he saw her, he stood up and smiled. "You came," he said. She nodded. "Fred said it was urgent." "It is," he replied. "Please, sit." The waiter served them grilled fish and juice. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The sound of crickets and gentle jazz music filled the air. Finally, Johnson said, "Cynthia, do you know what day it is today?" She frowned. "No, sir. It's exactly 1 year since you saved me under that bridge." Her eyes widened. "1 year already?" He nodded. "And every single day since then, I've been thinking about what that meant. Not just for my life, but for my heart." She froze, eyes locked on him. "Cynthia," he continued, voice tender, "I've met powerful people, rich people, famous people. But no one ever made me feel truly alive until you jumped into that water. You didn't care about who I was. You just cared that I was human." Cynthia blinked back tears. "Sir, you don't have to say all this. He shook his head gently. "I want to. You've become my best friend. My peace. My reason to look forward to mornings again." She was silent, her heart pounding so loud she could barely breathe. He smiled softly. "You told me once your parents taught you to be kind. I think they also taught you how to love. And somehow you've taught me too." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "You've given me more than I ever dreamed of," she whispered. "You changed my life, sir." "Then let me change the rest of it," he said. He stood slowly, reached into his pocket, and pulled out a small silver box. When he opened it, the diamond ring sparkled under the garden lights. Cynthia gasped. "Sir, what are you doing?" Johnson went down on one knee. "Cynthia Ease," he said, his voice trembling just slightly. "You saved my life when everyone walked away. You showed me that love doesn't begin with wealth, it begins with kindness. Will you marry me?" For a moment, Cynthia couldn't speak. Her hands shook, her vision blurred with tears. "Sir, Just then, the garden lights flickered and thunder rumbled in the distance. Raindrops began to fall, gentle but steady, like a blessing from above. Johnson didn't move. He stayed on his knee, rainwater soaking his suit. "Say yes," he whispered, smiling up at her through the falling drops. Cynthia laughed through her tears. "You're going to get sick again," she said. He laughed too. "Then save me again." And in that moment, as the rain poured harder, as lightning flashed across the sky, Cynthia fell to her knees and hugged him tightly. "Yes," she whispered against his shoulder. "Yes, I'll marry you." Applause suddenly filled the air. Fred and some staff had been standing nearby, watching quietly under umbrellas. They cheered, clapping and smiling. Johnson smiled through the rain, still holding her close. "I told you, kindness always finds its way home." That night, as they walked back hand in hand through the rain, Cynthia couldn't help but remember that first day. The bridge, the cold water, the faces that had doubted her. Now the same kind orphan who had once fought death for a stranger was walking beside the man she saved, her future husband, her miracle, her proof that kindness truly changes everything. But their story wasn't over yet. Something unexpected was waiting for them. Something that would test everything they believed about fate, love, and destiny itself. The wedding day came with a sunrise so golden, it felt like heaven itself was smiling. The church was filled with people, governors, business moguls, employees from Johnson's group, and ordinary Lagos residents who still remembered the orphan girl who saved the billionaire. Reporters stood outside the gate, cameras flashing like fireworks. Every TV station carried the headline, "Cynthia Easy, the orphan who found love and changed a billionaire's life." Inside, Cynthia stood before the mirror in a white gown that shimmered softly with every breath. Her hair was neatly packed in a bun, a few loose curls framing her glowing face. When she smiled, even the makeup artist paused to stare. "I can't believe this is me," Cynthia whispered. Fred, who had been like a big brother to her since the day she met him, stood at the door in his suit. "Believe it, madam," he said proudly. "You've earned every bit of this moment." Cynthia turned to him, her voice trembling. "Sometimes I still wake up and think it's all a dream. That I'll open my eyes and find myself back on that bridge, selling water." Fred smiled. "You didn't just save a man that day. You changed two destinies, yours and his. The world will never forget it." When the church doors opened, the crowd stood as the soft sound of violins filled the air. Cynthia walked down the aisle slowly, arm in arm with Fred, who represented the father she'd lost. Her steps were calm but heavy with emotion. Ahead at the altar stood Johnson, tall, elegant in his cream suit, his eyes filled with tears he didn't try to hide. When she reached him, he took her hand and whispered, "You look like a dream I never thought would come true." "And you look like a man I never thought would survive," she whispered back, smiling through tears. The priest began the vows. When it was time for Johnson to speak, his voice shook with emotion. "Cynthia," he said, "you saw me when I was invisible. You reached for me when the world walked away. You gave me life when I had none left. From this day, I promise to love you with the same courage you showed when you saved me." Cynthia's turn came. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Johnson, you taught me that kindness never dies. You gave me more than wealth. You gave me purpose. From the day I pulled you from that water, I didn't just save a man. I met the reason I was born." The crowd erupted in applause. The priest smiled. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." When they kissed, it was not just love, it was destiny sealing its promise. Their honeymoon was quiet and private, on a small island near Calabar where the waves sang against the sand. They walked barefoot along the beach every evening, talking about everything, from dreams to fears to the people they once were. One night, as the wind blew softly and the sea glowed under moonlight, Johnson said, "Cynthia, sometimes I wonder, what if you hadn't jumped that day?" She smiled. "Maybe someone else would have saved you." He shook his head. "No, I think it had to be you. Because if I hadn't met you that way, I might never have known what love truly feels like." Cynthia leaned her head on his shoulder. "Maybe that's what fate is. Not a miracle we wait for, but a choice we make when no one is watching." When they returned to Lagos, Cynthia became more than just the wife of a billionaire. She became a symbol. Her story inspired millions of Nigerians. Schools invited her to speak to students about kindness and courage. NGOs partnered with her to start a foundation called the Kind Hands Initiative, which sponsored orphaned children in STEM education. Johnson often said, "You didn't just save me, Cynthia. You're saving generations." But life has its ways of testing even the strongest hearts. One evening, 2 years into their marriage, Cynthia found Johnson sitting alone in his study. Papers were spread across his desk, and his face looked heavy with worry. "Johnson," she said gently, "you've been quiet all day." He looked up and smiled weakly. "Just business issues, love. A rival company is trying to take over one of our projects. Nothing we can't handle." She came closer, placing her hand on his shoulder. "We'll get through it. Together." He took her hand and kissed it. "We always do." The next week, during a tense board meeting, Johnson suddenly clutched his chest. Everyone panicked. The meeting was abandoned, and Fred rushed him to the hospital. Cynthia's heart nearly stopped when she got the call. At St. Luke's, the same hospital where she'd once saved him, she ran through the halls barefoot, her white dress soaked with tears. The doctors worked on him for hours. When the door finally opened, the lead doctor said, "He's stable, Mom. It was stress and exhaustion, not a heart attack. He just needs rest." Cynthia burst into tears of relief. She ran into the room, held his hand and whispered, "Don't you dare leave me again." He smiled weakly. "I won't. Not after all you've done to find me twice." She sat beside him the whole night, watching him sleep, remembering the man she once carried from the river. Now she was carrying him again, not in her arms, but in her heart. Months passed. Johnson recovered, and their love grew even deeper. They started spending evenings in the garden where he had proposed years before. The fountain still flowed, and the jasmine still filled the air. One night, Cynthia looked up at the stars and said softly, "You know, I always prayed for a family. I just didn't know how or when." Johnson turned to her smiling. "Maybe it's time we make that prayer come true." And a year later, it did. Cynthia gave birth to twin boys, Benson and Bernard, named after their late fathers. The hospital corridor was filled with laughter and joy. Johnson held the babies in his arms, tears streaming down his cheeks. "They have your eyes," he said softly. "And your smile," she replied, brushing his cheek with her hand. The nurses watched, smiling at the couple whose love story had become a legend in the city. From Orphan and Beggar to Billionaire and Wife, theirs was a tale people whispered about, a story parents told their children before bed. One evening, months later, Johnson and Cynthia sat outside their mansion watching the sunset. Their twins slept peacefully in their cribs nearby. The world seemed quiet, peaceful. Johnson took her hand. "Do you remember that day under the bridge?" he asked. "How could I forget?" she said, smiling. "I remember the sound of your voice shouting through the water. I remember thinking, why would anyone fight so hard for me? And now I know. You weren't just saving me. You were saving the man who was meant to love you." Cynthia leaned her head on his shoulder. "And you saved me too. You showed me that being kind is never a waste." He kissed her forehead. "Our whole life started with kindness. Maybe that's the greatest kind of love, the one that doesn't ask for anything back." The orange glow of the sunset bathed them in light. The fountain sparkled. The sound of their babies breathing softly behind them mixed with the quiet hum of the city. Cynthia looked up at him, eyes filled with gratitude. "If I had to do it all over again," she whispered, "I'd jump into that water 1,000 times." Johnson smiled, his arm tightening around her. "And I'd wait 1,000 times to be found by you." And as the stars began to appear one by one above Lagos that night, the world outside their mansion moved on. Cars honked, streetlights blinked, and the city buzzed. But inside that garden, one truth remained. Kindness had written the greatest love story of all. What is your view about this story? Where are you watching from? If you enjoyed this story, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel for more interesting stories.